As the sun veiled itself behind the mountain peaks, anguish grew within him. He knew what would come next. Without shelter, they're easy prey for whatever was out there. He hastened his pace as he moved towards the town ahead. Questions of what this world had become permeated through his mind. Only days had gone by since the world was plunged into chaos, and he had lived a rather normal life before that. An average man lost in the sea of people living lives just as complex as his. He lived by a strong moral compass, a pacifist by nature. Not that any of that would matter now. But approaching the town, his train of thought would be disrupted as he heard a guttural screech off in the distance, centering him back into the moment before spiraling into more useless threads of thought. He would make his way into the nearest building, not paying attention to which, seeing that the town looked as if it had been abandoned for some time, with bricks that had started to fall apart, leaving holes in the walls, left to be covered in the overgrowth from nature's lifelong battle with the man-made. Faded signs advertised products lost to time, found only in the weathered paper, and vehicles were scattered along the street side. Some held up by bricks with tires that were missing, and others with windshields that seemed to have caved in years ago. Entering the fairly small building, he found it to be unusually dark, filling him with a sense of unease, a feeling that he would end up ignoring as he trudged deeper into this false sanctuary. After walking for what felt like an unusually long amount of time, his attention would be caught by the faint orange glow that crept from around the corner. As a chill escaped him, creeping along his spine, he would find himself instinctually moving towards that light, and before he even realized, there he stood in front of the roar of a fire. Warmth grew over him as the flames flickered, crackling as it continues in its almost rhythmic dance. Regaining his footing he didn't know he had lost, he finally found the frame of mind to take in the space around him. Looking from the fire to the bricks that surrounded the heated dance, it wasn't long before he noticed the walls that seemed to endlessly crawl up, lined with books of various colors and sizes. And as he took in the rest of his surroundings, he would notice the countless amount of shelves that seemed to go on forever, all filled in with books, although more sparsely than the tightly packed walls. Looking for how he got into the endlessly sprawling room, he couldn't see an entrance. He pondered on how he got in, or how he was supposed to get out. He started to pace through one of the rows of shelves, trying to find an exit to the room. Walking past the books, he was brought back to a simpler time. A time before the chaos. A time before even his adulthood. A time where he wasn't bothered by the real world, but where he could live in worlds of his own. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he thought of his mother. He thought of her library. A small room with shelves lined with literature from various authors. Stories that ranged from the events of the real world to exaggerated tales of fantasy. She had taken pride in the books she collected, the books she had read. It made sense. In place of her empathy, she used her intellect. Before he could finish that thought, he was interrupted by the sight of the same fireplace he had been walking away from just moments ago. From the dance of the flame to the bricks that bled into the endless wall of books. It was all the same. But how could that be? He didn't remember turning around, so how was this possible? Not being able to process what just happened, he decided to traverse the columns instead of the rows. Maybe he'd just taken the wrong way, and so he started to pace. He lacked any sense of urgency, as if he were procrastinating, worried as to what he would find at the end, but he still kept on track, letting his mind wander so that his current predicament wouldn't further deteriorate his sanity. But as he thought, his mind kept drifting to worries, fears that he deserved this, that this situation was a product of his own imperfections. When he was younger, he always thought of himself as a god, a role model for a stronger sense of living, but as he aged, he found himself attracted to sins, making mistakes that shatter his own worldview. Confronted by his own humanity, he had struggled to come to terms that he was no more perfect than the people around him, but he never truly realized that his mistakes didn't define him, that it wasn't the person who he had been, but the person he was, the changes he made to become better, the distance he created from his past. But what did that matter now? In a dying world, morality meant nothing, when all you could do was try to survive. But yet, his mind was plagued. Even when it didn't matter, it still meant something to him. But as his mind further darkened from his inability to let go, the sound of something crashing onto the floor would shake him back to reality. Frozen in fear, it would take moments going by before he would regain his nerves and shakily make his way towards the sound, carefully peering over the side of each shelf he passed, until eventually laying eyes on a book that laid open on the ground. Going over to it, he picked it up, noticing a picture of an almost familiar woman on the page. She had black, wavy hair, reminiscent of an ocean at night, that fell to her sides, framing a face with tight features. She looked tired, having dark patches that consumed her eyes, rivaling the color of her hair. But more than that, her features were wrong. Her eyes were glossed over, almost milky, staring into an abyss with no end. Her mouth stretched into a grim frame. She looked as if she were in pain. And in that moment of realization of who he was looking at, he felt eyes on him. And as he brought his gaze up, he briefly locked eyes with something staring him down with a dull orange glow from the other side of the shelf, before it quickly rose to reveal its tall, slender figure, with gray, rotting flesh that tightly grasped onto the bone, shown through the tattered rag that only covered some areas of its unnerving frame. Petrified by the realization he was not alone, it took him only a moment to realize he was running, twisting and turning through various shelves in hopes of losing whatever that was. But as he moved, the sounds of footsteps echoed throughout his mind, growing louder and louder, faster and faster, soon completely taking over any thought in his head, until all he could hear was each footstep thundering through his mind, growing closer to him, and as that ever-pounding drum was right behind him, stopped. And so did he. Not out of want or desire, but there he stood again, confronted by the fire. However, this time, a book laid in the light of the rhythmic dance. Even from where he stood, he could see the page that was open, how it faced him, meant to be seen. And as those milky eyes stared back at him, a flame leapt from the fire, landing directly onto the page. And before he was able to do anything to stop it, without its brick-laid stage, the dance continued to grow, crawling across book and shelf, until the room around him was engulfed in flame, taunting him with its dance. The flicker of flames, the music of fire, drowned his thoughts. He grew hot as the light consumed him, and then, like a burning page, the room started to ash away, revealing holes of nothing but white, and as the floor gave way under him, he found himself falling. It felt like a speck rolling down a freshly opened canvas, dirtying the purity of the white around him. As he fell, fear would grasp onto him, not knowing where he would land or how. He shut his eyes, only to be greeted back to him falling in the empty sea of white. Confused and panicked by his inability to escape, there he fell, in what would seem to be his own purgatory. Was this death? Falling in nothing, surrounded by no one? He couldn't accept that. He started to flail, trying to move somewhere other than down, but when that didn't work, he realized there was only one thing he hadn't tried. He opened his eyes. The chatter of the audience filled the room, endless conversations with no way to decipher what any one person says, a hum of voices. There he stood on a set of metal bleachers surrounded by his peers, all dressed up for their performance. Looking out on the crowd, he realized a seat was left open, her seat. Crestfallen, he looked around the bleachers, realizing everyone was turned from him, surrounded by the backs of his peers. There was nowhere for him to move. But he needed to go. He shouldn't have been there. He knew he wasn't welcomed. As a tear escaped him, it rolled down his cheek, letting go, ready to embrace the cool metal floor. Splashing onto the bleachers, the room went silent. With everyone now facing him, he realized that what stood around him, what sat in the audience, was nothing more than mannequins. But yet, burning into him, eyes were hidden, shielding his gaze to better see the audience. Far in the back, he saw the dull orange gaze that he met in the library. Landing with a thud, he let out a grunt as pain shot through his body. He looked around in front of him. The room was dark, everything illuminated in a dull gray, making the room feel cold. Although he couldn't make out anything in the room, it felt familiar, but the pain he felt left him immobile. As he lay there, a warmth would slowly creep up his body, and as it crept up towards his face, it would be accompanied by a faint orange glow illuminating the area around him. Unease churned in his stomach. With the little strength he had left, he pushed himself up to discover the source of the light. Shifting his gaze up, there he saw it, looming tall above him. Decayed skin gripped onto bone, wearing tattered cloth that once used to be clothing, but now looked like nothing more than rags that molded to the flesh. And as he finally fixated on the face, he would notice that it didn't have eyes, but instead, orange light danced inside its orifices. However, what would truly disturb him is that when he took in all the details of his face, it was him. Staring at his own corpse looming above him, the cold gray room faded to black, submerging him in darkness until he could no longer see his horrifying reflection. Dragging in a breath, his lungs filled, but it was wrong. It wasn't air that filled his lungs. No, it was too heavy. So heavy. He felt crushed under the weight until nothing could be heard. Nothing could be seen. Nothing could be felt. Nothing would seem to last forever, stretching out everywhere, yet nowhere at all. Nothing would feel like all that's left, but as he continued to drift through nothing, something would break through that darkness. A voice, as if far in the distance, yet right behind. He would hear a familiar woman calling out to him. Suddenly, completely aware, his eyes would jut open as his lungs dispelled pitch-black water, pouring out from his mouth, the waterfall of a denied death. Sucking in air with greed, the sting of salt would remind him of the life he still had, yet relief would not follow. Instead, dread would take residence over his body. As each breath would wake him more, all that would become clear would be what he saw. He was panicked, his mind racing. What gave chase was no monster, but a nightmare worse than any other, because what would stalk him, lead him to run, and confront him when nothing was left, was himself. It made his heart race. He was his own monster, and that wasn't something he could outrun. But is it something he could live with? Would it let him live? Confusion cutting through the panic, it calmed him down enough to take in his surroundings. He would find himself on a shoreline, soaked and cold as the breeze of the salty air made each droplet of water feel like pinpricks along his skin. Off in the distance, he would see a tall structure, though in the darkness and fog, it was hard to determine what it could be. Picking himself up, he would brush the wet mush of sand off his body and make his way towards what he hoped would be shelter. As he walked, he thought to himself that wherever it was he washed up, something about it felt familiar. Nowhere he had been, but possibly something he'd seen. Almost as if he was making his way through a painting from his childhood. However strange that would seem to him. But as he closed the distance between the structure, he was now able to tell what it was, making his stomach turn, realizing the familiarity. As what stood in front of him was a lighthouse, one just like on the labels of the various bottles she would bring home, making their way to lay empty in little hiding spots around the house and even in the car. Bottles that led into ugly confrontation, screaming matches, and the final night. Quickly shaking away the thoughts, not wanting to linger, he made his way towards the lighthouse, eventually finding himself at a door barely holding on. With a tug at the entrance, the rotting wood released the latches, letting the husk of its former glory fall to the side. Paying no mind to the decrepit state of the building, he would make his way inside. Greeted by air that wasn't rushing over him, he took a breath. With little light, there wasn't much he could make out. Not that there was much he needed as long as he could find something warm. Feeling his way around the rounded structure, it wouldn't be long before he found a little room that would seem to be a sleeping quarters. Finding a bed that was fully made, as if someone didn't make it to their next night of sleep. The weight of everything finally sunk in, and he'd felt as if his eyes were made of stone. Unable to remember the last time he slept, he untucked the blanket and crawled into the bed, quickly letting the hands of sleep take him. However, even while he slept, he couldn't truly rest. Nightmares consumed him as his fears could not hide, each dream a story of what he's lost, a tale of an apocalypse. Finding himself at a house with strangers bonded through trauma, they had to move quick, but one had grown sick. A mother. Unable to leave the shelter, it was only a matter of time, but with everyone antsy to leave, her son would stay by her side. Before leaving, the son gave him a memento for all he had done for them. Not wanting to leave, but knowing they had to, they shared a final glance before leading the group to safer land. As they trekked on, he would notice a wheelchair. Lighting up like lightning, he would grab the thing and make his way back to the boy and his mother as fast as he could. He found himself there, all too late, as nothing but bodies would be left. Falling to his knees, he felt emotions swell, but before a tear could make its escape, one would fall from the ceiling, landing on him, drawing his attention up, where he would be greeted by the contorted features of himself, drowning the rooms in pools of black, taking his last breath as the black, viscous liquid rose. His eyes would snap open as a faint light crept through the door of the sleeping quarters. Not fully processing what was happening, he would stumble out of bed, where he'd noticed the source of the light coming from above. Nervously, he would make his way up the stairs, finding it to become brighter and brighter as he climbed the endless spiral, until finally he confronted a ladder, using it to reach the top. What he already suspected was confirmed when he saw as the lighthouse roared with life as the bright light danced in its continuous circle. Shielding his eyes as to not be blinded, he would make his way to the outer railing to see if he could find what happened to bring this lighthouse back in order. But looking down, he'd be struck with vertigo, as he took in how high he truly was, finding that below him, nothing but black waves crashed into a cliffside of many rocks. As the waves continued to crash against a wall made by time, he found himself entranced, reminded of her. What should be thoughts of comfort were nothing but unease. An uncomfortable feeling would blossom in his chest as he couldn't seem to bring himself away from the thoughts of her, what she had done, what he had done. As his eyes would begin to sting, tears would fall. A selfish feeling would take over as he wished things were normal, but they could never go back. The world has changed. Things were different, and so he continued to stare out on the waves. But eventually, something would break through that darkness. Breathing. As if right behind. He swung around to see him, skin darkened from decay, clenching onto bone, with a face that shared the features of him, although more tight, with eyes that were pools of fire as the orange flames danced inside its cage. Fear gripping onto him, he would try to back up, but losing his footing, he would slip and find himself on the other side of the railing. Plummeting, he would notice as the decayed face leered at him as it seemed to grow further and further away. Realizing what's to come next, he squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for an impact he couldn't survive. Yet as time passed, nothing would happen. It wouldn't be until he felt brakes tug his body forward in a stop he wasn't ready for that he'd open his eyes. Fear gripped onto him as he noticed the bus was at his stop. Looking around at peers that felt like ghosts of a distant past, a ringing would take space in his head. Pushing through the rows of seats, he'd make his way off the bus, unable to take in the familiar surroundings. The chill of an autumn start, the silence of a neighborhood at rest. Even alone, he felt his eyes peered at him, looking around at homes that hid their secrets of their owners. He couldn't find the eyes that felt to grow more intense by the moment. Unsure of what to do, he cautiously made his way to a house that never felt like home.
each step feeling like an echo through his mind. Approaching the street he'd turned down hundreds of times before, he froze to take in what he thought he'd never have to relive. Moments would pass as he stood there, waiting for time to reveal the mirage, but as the house at the end of the street continued to stand there was only one thing he could do. Feeling impossibly heavy, he would make the first step leading into the second, and then the third. One after another, unease ripped through his entire self. Going back to that place, that house, made him nauseous. He couldn't imagine what waited behind those doors, the secrets that house kept. But as the road's endless stretch came to a close, he was confronted by memories that darkened his mind. The unease would brew into something worse, something he hadn't felt since then. As the venomous feeling grew inside him, he would take his first steps into a garage lined with gray and red tiles on the floor, past the smoke-stained couch, and next to a dartboard where shots would never be made, stood the door. The one that led him inside, the one that he had entered so many times before. Reaching out to the brass doorknob, the cool feeling would bring him moments' peace as he twisted it, giving way to a burst of air so familiar it brought a tear to his eye. But that tear would not fall alone, as it was what he heard that would make him weak. The laughter of a sibling long lost to time and pain. Running up those stairs, paying no mind to his surroundings, he would freeze to see as his brother sat there, playing with the toys oh so familiar to him. Frozen for only a moment, he'd rush him into a hug of years of pain. Tears would flood from his eyes, giving way to a pounding in his head. The pain gripped him hard, but he could care less as the last piece of his heart was there in his embrace. Pushing off of him, the brother sat there confused, not made any easier to understand by the tears continuing to pour out from his face. But as the creak of the door downstairs led into the sound of a hard shut, it dawned that all good things must come to an end. As joints popped with each step up the stairs, venom started to take its residence within him, each step fueling a bitter taste into his mouth. Head cresting above the staircase, he'd see him, that living corpse. Fearing the worst, he stood ready to oppose the anger that hurt him so many times before. The same feelings that hurt and took away the last piece of his heart. But as that corpse approached, it simply pushed him aside, making him fall back into the kitchen. Fear gripped him as he saw his mangled self make his way towards his heart. His brother wore a panicked look as fear widened his eyes, unable to do anything but back away. He couldn't let this happen again. This couldn't be how this goes. He couldn't let it. Fear taking over, he was no longer in control. His actions not his own. He'd grab a blade encased in a wood block and rush over to the corpse that haunted him long enough. Shoving it down, he would embrace it, thrusting sharpened steel towards it. Holding the knife tightly, he felt as the steel made contact with skin, and with not much effort, ripped through it, plunging the knife deep into its chest. Not satisfied with the first thrust, he would remove the knife from the fleshy casing and thrust it again and again and again. Blackened blood would splatter across his hands and his face as he continued to plunge this blade in and out, over and over, never satisfied with the last stab. Not after everything. He was lost to that rage, a taste almost as bitter as the metallic splatters that would make it into his mouth. No. It would be too late before the crying broke through the static playing in my head. Looking away from the mangled corpse below me, I see as my heart cried out. Fear in his eyes. Fear not for the body under me, but no. He was scared of me. Pushing myself up, leaving a bloody handprint, I couldn't think as to what I should say. What I should do. He screamed out to me, asking me why I did it. How could I? But I just wanted to protect you from... Looking over to the corpse, color fled from my face as I fell to my knees. There she laid, hair like the blackest of waves, framing her face, with eyes that had grown milky, in a mouth that stretched tight. I did it. I killed her. Terror stricken over me, I would rush my way out of the house, just running further and further as I tried to push what happened behind me. Days passing, he found himself growing tired. And as the sun veiled itself behind the mountain peaks, anguish grew within him. He knew what would come next. Without shelter, they're easy prey for whatever was out there.